Sarah thought she'd found paradise in Willowbrook Estates, until Margaret Chen moved in next door with her HOA clipboard and measuring tape. What started as a $500 fine for pool toys spiraled into a neighborhood war that would expose secrets, shatter friendships, and bring down the very foundation of Margaret's perfect life. When Sarah discovered what Margaret was hiding behind her pristine fence, she realized the woman who'd made her life hell had been living a lie. And sometimes karma doesn't just knock, it brings a demolition crew. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Estates as Sarah Mitchell pulled into her driveway, the trunk of her Honda Civic loaded with groceries and the promise of a peaceful Saturday. She'd moved to this cookie-cutter subdivision 18 months ago, drawn by the manicured lawns, the sense of community, and the sparkling pool in her backyard that had sealed the deal. At 34, divorced and starting over, she'd thought she'd found her sanctuary. She was wrong. The sharp rap on her front door came at exactly 8:47 a.m. She knew because she'd been checking her phone, wondering if her teenage daughter Emma would call from her father's house. Sarah opened the door to find Margaret Chen standing on her porch, clipboard in hand, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her face into permanent disapproval. "Mrs. Mitchell," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no. "I'm here on official HOA business." Margaret was in her early 60s, impeccably dressed in a crisp white blouse and navy slacks despite the early hour. She'd been the Homeowners Association president for 7 years running, a fact she mentioned with the frequency of a broken record. Her house, directly next door, was a monument to suburban perfection, not a blade of grass out of place, not a single decoration that violated the HOA's extensive guidelines. "Good morning, Margaret," Sarah said, already feeling her stomach. Thought. In the 6 months since Margaret had moved in next door, these visits had become as regular as they were unwelcome. "What can I help you with?" Margaret's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone about to deliver bad news. She flipped through the papers on her clipboard with theatrical precision. "I'm afraid I have to issue you a citation for violation of HOA Regulation 7.3.2, Outdoor Recreational Equipment Storage." Sarah blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Your pool toys, Mrs. Mitchell. They're in clear violation of our community standards." Margaret gestured toward Sarah's backyard, where a collection of colorful pool toys floated innocently in the crystal-clear water, a couple of beach balls, some pool noodles, and Emma's favorite inflatable unicorn. "They're in my pool," Sarah said slowly, as if explaining to a child. "In my private backyard." "Visible from public areas," Margaret countered, consulting her clipboard again. "Mrs. Patterson's second-floor guest room has a clear view of your pool area. The toys create an unsightly appearance that degrades our property values." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived 3 houses down, had been nothing but kind to her. She doubted the woman had ever complained about pool toys. "I bought this house specifically for the pool," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice level. "My daughter visits every other weekend, and those toys make her happy. They're not hurting anyone." Margaret's smile was arctic. "Unfortunately, personal preferences don't supersede community regulations. The fine is $500, payable within 30 days. She tore off a yellow carbon copy and held it out. Sarah stared at the paper. $500. That was her grocery budget for 2 months. "This is ridiculous. They're pool toys, not abandoned cars." "The board voted unanimously," Margaret said, her tone suggesting the discussion was over. "Perhaps next time you'll consult the HOA guidelines before making decorative choices." "Decorative choices?" Sarah's voice rose. "They're toys. For a child." Margaret's expression softened into what might have been sympathy on anyone else's face, but looked calculating on hers. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you're new to community living. These rules exist to protect all of us. When one homeowner ignores the standards, it creates a domino effect. Before you know it, you have above-ground pools, garden gnomes, and basketball hoops cluttering the landscape." The condescension in her tone was the final straw. Sarah had been polite, accommodating, and patient through months of petty complaints. Her mailbox was 2 inches too far to the left, her hedge was 3 inches too tall, her porch light wasn't the approved shade of white. But this crossed a line. "You know what, Margaret?" Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "I'll pay your fine, but I'm also going to request a full audit of every property in this neighborhood. If we're going to enforce rules, let's enforce them fairly." Margaret's composed mask slipped for just a moment. "I'm sorry?" "You heard me. If pool toys are such a threat to property values, then surely you won't mind if we examine every home for violations, starting with yours." The color drained from Margaret's face. That's not necessary. The board handles these matters on a case-by-case basis." "Oh, I insist," Sarah said, warming to the idea. "In fact, I'll volunteer to help. After all, if we're protecting property values, we need to be thorough." Margaret clutched her clipboard tighter. "Mrs. Mitchell, I don't think you understand." "The time and resources?" "I have plenty of time," Sarah interrupted. "And if the rules are so important, then the resources should be available too. Unless..." She paused, studying Margaret's increasingly uncomfortable expression. "Unless there's a reason you'd prefer to keep the focus on pool toys?" For a long moment, the two women stared at each other across the threshold. Sarah could see the wheels, turning behind Margaret's cold eyes, calculations being made, risks being weighed. "Of course not," Margaret finally said, her composure reassembling itself like armor. "The board welcomes community involvement. I'll bring your suggestion to the next meeting." "Perfect," Sarah said sweetly. "I'll mark my calendar." Margaret turned to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Mitchell? I'd hate for this situation to escalate unnecessarily. Sometimes it's better to simply comply with established procedures." The warning in her voice was unmistakable, but Sarah was past caring about veiled threats. "Thanks for the advice, Margaret. I'll keep it in mind while I'm reviewing the HOA bylaws. All of them." As Margaret walked away, her usual confident stride slightly less assured, Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. She'd spent too many months being bulldozed by the woman's petty tyranny. If Margaret wanted to play hardball, Sarah was ready to swing back. She looked at the citation in her hand, then crumpled it up and tossed it in the recycling bin. $500 for pool toys. The audacity was breathtaking, but it had awakened something in Sarah that had been dormant too long. Her fighting spirit. That afternoon, as she floated in her pool with a glass of wine, deliberately leaving the colorful toys bobbing around her, Sarah began to plan. She'd lived in enough places to know that people who were quickest to point out others' violations usually had the most to hide. Margaret Chen was about to learn that some battles aren't worth starting. The sun was setting behind the perfectly manicured homes of Willowbrook Estates when Sarah noticed something she'd never paid attention to before: the way the light hit Margaret's backyard at just the right angle to reveal the outline of something, large and wooden, extending from the back of her house. Something that definitely hadn't been there in the HOA architectural plans she'd received when she'd moved in. Sarah smiled and reached for her phone. It was time to do some research. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Sarah grateful she'd chosen a house with a pool, even if that pool was currently the source of her legal troubles. She'd spent Sunday evening researching HOA regulations, property, records, and building permits with the determination of a detective on a cold case. What she'd found was enlightening. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had been formed in 2018, with Margaret Chen as its founding president. The woman had positioned herself as the guardian of property values from day one, establishing increasingly strict regulations that had driven out several families who couldn't keep up with the mounting fines and restrictions. Sarah had discovered online forums where former residents shared horror stories of Margaret's reign, $200 fines for Christmas decorations left up 3 days too long, $300 penalties for lawn mower tracks and grass, $500 citations for unapproved flower colors. But the most interesting discovery was what Sarah hadn't found: any building permits filed for Margaret's property in the past 3 years. Sarah knocked on the door of 1247 Maple Street at precisely 9 a.m. Tom Bradley answered, looking exactly like what Central Casting would order for friendly neighbor, Flannel shirt, coffee mug in hand, genuine smile. "Sarah, good to see you. Coffee?" Tom was a retired contractor who'd lived in Willowbrook since before the HOA existed. His house, while well-maintained, had the lived-in quality that Margaret's sterile perfection lacked. Garden tools by the shed, a basketball hoop in the driveway, wind chimes that actually moved in the breeze. "I'd love some," Sarah said, following him into a kitchen that smelled like bacon and fresh coffee. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." Tom poured her a mug and settled into the chair across from her. "Shoot. Have you ever filed a complaint with the HOA? About anyone's property?" Tom's laugh was bitter. "Honey, I've been on Margaret's hit list since day one. She's fined me for everything from my mailbox being the wrong shade of black to my garbage cans being visible from the street, even though they're behind my fence." "So you've never complained? About pool toys or anything in my yard?" "Hell no. Your place is beautiful, and seeing that little girl of yours playing in the pool reminds me why we moved to a neighborhood in the first place, for families, not for some museum." Sarah felt a surge of vindication. "What about Mrs. Patterson?" Margaret claimed she complained about the view from her guest room. Tom's expression darkened. "Eleanor Patterson is 83 years old and half blind. She can barely see her own mailbox, let alone pool toys 3 houses away. Margaret's been using Eleanor's name for months to justify her complaints. The poor woman doesn't even know." Sarah set down her coffee mug harder than intended. "That's fraud." "That's Margaret Chen," Tom said grimly. "But good luck proving it. She's got the board wrapped around her finger and they rubber stamp everything she wants." "What do you know about her backyard renovation?" Tom's eyebrows shot up. "What renovation?" Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him the photo she'd taken the night before. Carefully shot through gaps in the fence, showing the outline of what appeared to be a large deck structure extending from the back of Margaret's house. Tom whistled, though. "Well, I'll be damned. When did she build that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. There's no permit on file with the city." "There wouldn't be," Tom said, leaning back in his chair. "Margaret's been very careful about that. She had the work done in sections, always claiming it was maintenance or repairs to the existing structure. But if that's what I think it is..." He trailed off, studying the photos more carefully. "What do you think it is?" "A 2-story deck with what looks like an enclosed section. Maybe even living space." Tom looked up at her. "Sarah, if that's what this is, it's not just an unpermitted addition. It's a major structural modification that would require architectural review, engineering approval, and inspection at multiple stages." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "And HOA approval?" "Oh, absolutely. Any addition over a certain square footage requires full board review and neighbor notification. There should have been letters sent to everyone within 100 feet, public comment periods, the whole 9 yards. But there wasn't." "Nope." Tom grinned, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked predatory. "Sarah, I think you might have just found Margaret's Achilles heel." An hour later, Sarah was at City Hall, armed with Tom's expertise and a growing sense of righteous indignation. The building permits office was a study in bureaucratic efficiency, forms, filing cabinets, and a clerk named Janet who looked like she'd been stamping papers since the Eisenhower administration. "Property address?" Janet asked without looking up. Sarah provided Margaret's address and waited while Janet disappeared into the maze of filing cabinets. She returned 10 minutes later with a thin folder. "Last permit was 2019, kitchen renovation," Janet said, flipping through the documents. "Nothing since then." "Are you sure? There's been significant construction in the backyard." Janet's expression sharpened. She'd clearly seen this before. "Ma'am, if there's been unpermitted construction, you can file a complaint. We'll send an inspector out within 5 business days." Sarah's heart hammered as she filled out the complaint form. In the space marked "Reason for Complaint," she wrote, "Suspected unpermitted addition deck construction appears to be major structural modification without proper permits or inspections." "This will be anonymous?" Sarah asked. "Completely. The homeowner will only know that a complaint was filed, not by whom." Walking back to her car, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and guilt. She wasn't naturally vindictive, but months of Margaret's harassment had worn away her patience. If Margaret was going to weaponize HOA rules, then she should be prepared to live by all the rules, including the ones enforced by the city. Her phone rang as she was pulling out of the parking lot. Unknown. Number. Mrs. Mitchell, this is David Kim from the Willowbrook HOA board. I understand you've requested a comprehensive property audit of the neighborhood? Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Margaret had worked fast. That's correct. If we're going to enforce regulations, I think it should be done fairly, across all properties. There was a pause. Mrs. Mitchell, I want to be frank with you. Margaret Chen has been very thorough in her oversight of the community. Perhaps we could find a way to resolve your pool toy situation without involving additional inspections. The offer was tempting, but something in David's tone suggested desperation rather than generosity. What kind of resolution? Well, if you were to remove the toys during daylight hours, just store them in your garage or pool house, we could waive the fine. But keep them out of the pool when my daughter visits. Another pause. Perhaps we could work out designated pool hours, say weekends only. Sarah almost laughed. They were negotiating like she was asking to park a monster truck in her front yard instead of letting a child play with pool toys. Mr. Kim, I appreciate the offer, but I think a comprehensive audit is exactly what this community needs. Transparency benefits everyone. Mrs. Mitchell, please reconsider. Have a good day, Mr. Kim. Sarah hung up and immediately called Tom. They're scared, she told him. The board just offered to waive my fine if I drop the audit request. Which means Margaret's got something to hide, and they know it, Tom said. Sarah, be careful. Cornered animals do unpredictable things. That evening, Sarah was grilling dinner on her back patio when she heard raised voices from Margaret's yard. She moved closer to the fence, not quite eavesdropping, but not exactly minding her own business either. Told you this would happen? A man's voice was saying. I warned you about the permits. Keep your voice down, Margaret snapped. It's probably nothing. Some neighbor with too much time on their hands. Nothing? They're sending an inspector, Margaret. If they find what I think they're going to find, they won't find anything because there's nothing to find. It's maintenance. Work, remember? Repairs to existing structures. Repairs don't add 800 square feet and a second story. Sarah's eyes widened. 800 square feet. That wasn't just a deck, that was a whole additional living space. We'll deal with it, Margaret said, her voice dropping. We always do. The conversation moved inside, but Sarah had heard enough. She pulled out her phone and started taking more photos, this time with the telephoto lens. If Margaret was about to try to hide evidence, Sarah wanted documentation of what existed before the city inspector arrived. As she snapped pictures of the structure barely visible over the fence line, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just 3 days. She'd gone from victim to investigator, and the thrill of potentially catching Margaret in her own web of regulations was intoxicating. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Drop the audit request or face the consequences. Some battles aren't worth winning. Sarah stared at the message, her initial fear quickly transforming into anger. Margaret had crossed a line from petty harassment into intimidation. Sarah screenshotted the text and added it to the growing file. She was building. Two could play the documentation game. The next morning brought vindication in the form of a white city truck pulling up to Margaret's house. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as the inspector with a clipboard, apparently the week for Clip B. Sarah woke Thursday morning to the sound of power tools and shouting. She stumbled to her bedroom window and peered through the blinds to see Margaret's backyard in chaos. A crew of workers was frantically dismantling sections of the deck structure, while Margaret stood in her bathrobe directing them with the urgency of someone trying to hide evidence. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. The woman who'd cited her for pool toys at 8:47 a.m. was now running a construction crew before sunrise, probably violating half a dozen noise ordinances in the process. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Tom. Did you see the circus next door? She's trying to tear it down before the city comes back. But Margaret's midnight demolition project was too little, too late. By 10 a.m., Jim Rodriguez was back with a team of inspectors, and they weren't fooled by the hastily removed deck boards scattered across Margaret's lawn. "Ma'am, you can't demolish a structure while it's under investigation," Jim told Margaret, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dealt with panicked homeowners before. "I need you to stop all work immediately." "This is just maintenance," Margaret protested, but her usual composure was gone. Her silver hair was disheveled, her pristine appearance replaced by the frantic energy of someone watching their world collapse. "I'm simply removing some rotted boards." Jim gestured to the pile of clearly new lumber and the concrete footings that were now visible. "Ma'am, this is a major structural addition built without permits. The work stops now, or we'll have the police enforce the stop work order." Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: anger, desperation, and finally, defeat. The woman who had wielded HOA regulations like weapons was learning what real authority looked like. An hour later, Sarah's doorbell rang. She opened it to find David Kim, the HOA board member who'd called her earlier, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to talk." David was in his 40s with the tired expression of a man who'd gotten in over his head. Sarah led him to her living room, noting how his eyes kept darting toward Margaret's house. "This situation has gotten out of hand," David began. "The board is prepared to formally rescind your fine and issue a public apology." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "In exchange for?" "We'd like you to withdraw your audit request, and perhaps not pursue any further action regarding Mrs. Chen's property situation." Sarah studied his face. "David, are you asking me to cover up building code violations?" "No! God, no, nothing like that. It's just... Margaret's been under a lot of stress lately. Her husband passed away last year and she's been dealing with things in her own way." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd known Margaret was single, but she'd assumed it was by choice, divorce maybe, or simply someone who'd never married. The thought of grief driving the woman's need for control added a complexity Sarah hadn't expected. "I'm sorry for her loss," Sarah said quietly. "But that doesn't excuse months of harassment or building illegal structures." David ran his hands through his hair. Margaret founded this HOA because she genuinely believed she was protecting property values. After Richard died, it became more than that. It became her way of controlling something when everything else felt out of control. Sarah felt a pang of unexpected sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by months of accumulated frustration. "David, I've been fined for pool toys while she's built an illegal addition. Grief doesn't justify hypocrisy." "You're right," David said, and the admission seemed to surprise him. "The board has been... We've let Margaret run things without proper oversight. We're all neighbors, you know? We trusted her judgment. And now?" David looked defeated. "Now we're facing potential lawsuits from every homeowner she's fined over the past 3 years. If this gets out, and it will, people are going to want their money back. Some of those fines were substantial." Sarah was beginning to understand the scope of what she'd unleashed. "How much money are we talking about?" "Conservative estimate? $50,000 in fines over the past 3 years, and that's not counting the legal fees if people decide to sue the HOA for discriminatory enforcement." The number was staggering. Sarah had thought she was fighting one woman's petty tyranny, but she'd actually uncovered systematic abuse of power that had affected dozens of families. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked. "Help us fix this quietly. We'll reverse all of Margaret's questionable fines, establish new oversight procedures, and limit the HOA's authority to reasonable community standards." "And Margaret?" David's expression hardened. "Margaret will be stepping down as president. Immediately." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of shouting erupted from outside. They rushed to the window to see Margaret in her front yard, screaming at Jim Rodriguez while pointing at Sarah's house. "This is harassment. That woman has been targeting me since the day she moved in. She's vindictive and—" "Ma'am," Jim interrupted, his patience clearly exhausted. The building violations exist regardless of who reported them. Your personal disputes with neighbors don't change city code. Margaret's voice rose to a shriek. She's been taking pictures of my property, spying on me. This is stalking. Sarah felt David tense beside her. "Oh, this is bad," he muttered. Jim's response was professional but firm. "Ma'am, if you believe you're being harassed, you can file a police report. Right now, I need to focus on the building code violations." That's when Margaret made her fatal mistake. In a moment of pure desperation, she played her last card. "You don't understand. I'm the HOA president. I have authority over this entire neighborhood. These people have to follow my rules." Jim's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement if the situation weren't so serious. "Ma'am, HOA authority doesn't supersede city building codes, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to build unpermitted structures." The finality in his voice seemed to break something in Margaret. She stood there for a long moment, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, before turning and stalking back into her house. David exhaled slowly. "Well, that's going to end up on YouTube." He was right. Sarah could see several neighbors recording the confrontation with their phones. Margaret's public meltdown was being documented for posterity. That evening, Sarah was grilling chicken when her doorbell rang again. This time it was Eleanor Patterson, the elderly neighbor Margaret had been using as a shield for her complaints. Eleanor was exactly as Tom had described, a tiny woman with thick glasses and a walker, but her voice was clear and strong. "Dear, I heard there's been some confusion about complaints from my house," Eleanor said without preamble. Sarah invited her in, offering tea and a comfortable chair. "Mrs. Patterson, Margaret Chen has been claiming you complained about various things in the neighborhood. Pool toys specifically." Eleanor's laugh was surprisingly robust. "That woman has been putting words in my mouth for months. I can barely see my own garden, let alone pool toys 3 streets over. I told her as much when she first started using my name." "You told her to stop?" "I told her if she didn't stop lying about me filing complaints, I'd file a real complaint with the police for harassment." Sarah felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. "Mrs. Patterson, would you be willing to put that in writing?" "Already done, dear," Eleanor said, pulling a folded letter from her purse. "I've written statements about every complaint Margaret claimed I made, all lies, every one of them." As Sarah read through Eleanor's detailed account of Margaret's deception, she realized the situation was even worse than she'd thought. Margaret hadn't just been overzealous, she'd been committing fraud, using Eleanor's name to legitimize complaints that never existed. "There's more," Eleanor said quietly. "That addition she built? It blocks the morning sun from my garden. I mentioned it to her once, just in passing, and she flew into a rage. Told me I was an ungrateful old woman who should mind her own business." Sarah looked up from the letter. "She said that to you?" "Oh, yes, and that if I ever caused trouble for her, she'd make sure the HOA found violations with my property, too." Eleanor's eyes flashed with anger. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, dear. I was here before there was an HOA. I don't take kindly to threats." That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table reviewing everything she'd learned. Margaret's grief might explain her need for control, but it didn't excuse fraud, intimidation, or abuse of power. The woman had systematically terrorized neighbors, stolen money through illegitimate fines, and built an illegal structure while punishing others for minor infractions. Her phone rang. Unknown number again. "You've destroyed everything." Margaret's voice was barely recognizable, hoarse from crying or shouting. "I hope you're happy." "Margaret, this didn't have to happen this way. If I just what? Let you turn this neighborhood into chaos? Those rules exist for a reason." "What about your rules, Margaret? What about building permits and city codes?" The silence stretched so long, Sarah thought the call had dropped. "Richard and I planned that deck together," Margaret finally whispered. "It was going to be our retirement project. After he died, I needed to build something. I needed to create something that would last." For the first time, Sarah heard genuine vulnerability in Margaret's voice, but it was too late for sympathy to change the sea. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor, a woman in her 30s with Margaret's sharp cheekbones but softer eyes, carrying a box of tissues and the weight of someone delivering bad news. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Jennifer Chen, Margaret's daughter. I was hoping we could talk." Sarah led Jennifer to her kitchen, noting the family resemblance and the exhaustion that seemed to radiate from the younger woman. "I flew in from Seattle last night," Jennifer began, accepting the offered coffee with shaking hands. "Mom called me. She was hysterical. Something about the city forcing her to tear down Dad's deck?" The pain in Jennifer's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her resolve waver slightly. "I'm sorry about your father. I didn't know that he died last year. Mom doesn't talk about it. She throws herself into HOA work instead." Jennifer's laugh was bitter. "I should have seen this coming." "What do you mean?" Jennifer stared into her coffee cup. "After Dad died, Mom became obsessed with control. Everything had to be perfect. Orderly? Exactly right. She reorganized their entire house 3 times. She learned every HOA rule by heart and started enforcing them like her life depended on it." Sarah remained silent, sensing that Jennifer needed to talk. The deck was Dad's idea. He'd drawn up plans, picked out materials, the whole thing. But he got sick before they could start construction. Jennifer's voice cracked. "Mom built it as a memorial, but she was so focused on making it perfect that she ignored all the practical stuff, permits, inspections, building codes. She just built what Dad had dreamed of." The revelation cast Margaret's actions in a new light, but Sarah had learned too much to let sentiment override facts. "Jennifer, your mother has been terrorizing this neighborhood for months. She's filed fraudulent complaints, collected illegal fines, and intimidated elderly neighbors." Jennifer's face crumpled. "I know. God, I know. The woman you're describing isn't the mother who raised me. This grief, it's poisoned everything good about her." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of engines filled the air. Through the window, they watched a convoy of city vehicles pull up to Margaret's house, inspectors, engineers, and what looked like a structural assessment team. "They're not wasting time," Jennifer observed. "The city doesn't play games with unpermitted construction." They watched as Margaret emerged from her house, dressed in her usual crisp attire but moving like someone in a trance. The woman who'd once commanded neighborhood meetings with military precision now looked fragile and lost. "She's going to lose everything," Jennifer whispered. "The deck, the HOA position, probably the house if she can't pay the fines and legal fees." Sarah felt an unexpected stab of guilt. The house? She took out a home equity loan to pay for the construction. If the city fines her for unpermitted work, and if homeowners sue the HOA for the fraudulent fines. Jennifer shrugged helplessly. She could lose everything Dad left her. The weight of consequences was becoming real in a way Sarah hadn't anticipated. She'd wanted justice for months of harassment, but watching a grieving widow potentially lose her home felt like something else entirely. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked. Jennifer looked surprised by the question. "I don't know. I guess I hoped. Could you find it in your heart to show her some mercy? Maybe talk to the city about a payment plan or something?" Before Sarah could answer, her doorbell rang. Tom Bradley stood on her porch with a grim expression and a manila folder. "Sarah, we need to talk, both of you," he said, noticing Jennifer through the window. Tom laid the folder on Sarah's kitchen table with the gravity of someone presenting evidence at trial. "I've been doing some digging since this all started. What I found, it's bigger than just Margaret." He opened the folder to reveal bank statements, canceled checks, and financial records. The HOA account has been systematically drained over the past 2 years. Margaret's been using association funds for personal expenses. Sarah's stomach dropped. What kind of expenses? Construction? Materials, contractor payments, landscaping for her property. She's embezzled nearly $30,000 from the HOA account. Jennifer's face went white. "No, That's impossible. Mom wouldn't. I'm sorry, Jennifer, but the evidence is clear. She's been funding her memorial deck with money she stole from her neighbors. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Sarah stared at the documents, feeling the last of her sympathy for Margaret evaporate. The woman hadn't just been grief-stricken, she'd been a thief. This changes everything, Sarah said quietly. Tom nodded grimly. I've already called the police. Financial crimes unit will be here within the hour. Jennifer began to cry, not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh sobs of someone watching their world shatter. She's going to prison, isn't she? Neither Sarah nor Tom answered, but they didn't need to. Embezzlement on this scale wasn't something that could be explained away by grief or resolved with community service. Through the window, they watched as Margaret stood in her backyard, surrounded by city officials who were documenting every aspect of her illegal construction. She looked small and defeated, a far cry from the imperious figure who'd terrorized the neighborhood. I should go to her, Jennifer said, wiping her eyes. Jennifer, Sarah said gently, you might want to call a lawyer first. As Jennifer left, to face the wreckage of her mother's life, Sarah found herself alone with Tom and the crushing weight of what she'd set in motion. I never intended for it to go this far, she said. Tom's expression was sympathetic but firm. Sarah, you filed a complaint about building code violations. Everything else, the embezzlement, the fraud, the abuse of power, that's all on Margaret. You just pulled the thread that unraveled it. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she'd become something she'd never intended to be, the instrument of someone's complete destruction. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Kim. Emergency board meeting tonight. Your presence requested but not required. We need to discuss dissolution of the HOA. The message brought home the full scope of what was happening. Margaret hadn't just destroyed herself. She'd destroyed the entire community organization she'd claimed to protect. That afternoon, Sarah sat by her pool, staring at the colorful toys that had started this entire chain of events. Emma's inflatable unicorn bobbed peacefully in the water, oblivious to the chaos it had inadvertently caused. The sound of sirens drew her attention back to Margaret's house. 2 police cars and an unmarked sedan had joined the city vehicles. Through gaps in the fence, Sarah could see Margaret in handcuffs, being led to one of the police cars while Jennifer stood helplessly on the sidewalk. The sight should have felt like victory, but instead it felt like tragedy. Margaret Chen, HOA tyrant and neighborhood terrorist, had become Margaret Chen, arrested widow who'd lost everything to grief and desperation. Sarah's phone rang. Unknown number. I hope you're satisfied. Jennifer's voice was thick with tears and anger. My mother is in jail. She's lost her house, her freedom, and what's left of her dignity. Was it worth it? Was your right to have pool toys worth destroying a human being? The question hit Sarah like a slap. Jennifer, I never wanted... You never wanted what? You never wanted to humiliate an elderly widow? You never wanted to send a grieving mother to prison? What exactly did you want, Sarah? Sarah struggled for words. I wanted her to stop. I wanted the harassment to end. I wanted fair treatment. Well, congratulations, you got it. And you destroyed someone in the process. The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with her pool toys, and the growing certainty that winning could feel an awful lot like losing. As the sun set over Willowbrook Estates, police cars and city vehicles finally departed, leaving Margaret's house dark and empty. The illegal deck stood half demolished, a monument to dreams deferred and rules broken. Sarah floated in her pool as darkness fell, surrounded by the toys that had started it all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The HOA meeting, decisions about restitution, the complex process of rebuilding a community that had been poisoned by its own leader. But tonight, she couldn't escape the feeling that in her quest for justice, she'd become the very thing she'd fought against. Someone who used power to destroy another person's life. The pool toys bobbed silently around her, innocent and colorful, oblivious to the price of their freedom. Saturday morning brought an unusual sight to Willowbrook Estates. Sarah Mitchell standing on Margaret Chen's front porch with a casserole dish and a heavy heart. The house looked abandoned, windows dark, newspapers piling up on the walkway despite it being only 24 hours since Margaret's arrest. Jennifer answered the door looking like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her clothes wrinkled, and she carried the exhausted desperation of someone trying to hold together a life that was falling apart. "What do you want?" Jennifer's voice was flat, drained of the anger from their phone call. "I brought food," Sarah said simply, "and I wanted to talk." Jennifer stared at the casserole dish as if it might explode. "You brought my mother's victim a casserole?" "I brought a neighbor food during a crisis. That's what people do." Despite everything, Jennifer stepped aside to let her in. Margaret's house was immaculate as expected, but it felt like a museum. Everything perfect, nothing lived in. Family photos lined the mantel, showing happier times when Margaret and Richard had smiled together, when Jennifer had been a young girl with pigtails instead of a woman dealing with her mother's arrest. "Bail hearing is Monday," Jennifer said, settling into a chair that looked like it had never been sat in. "Lawyer says she'll probably get out, but the charges—" She trailed off, staring at a wedding photo on the side table. Sarah sat across from her, noting how Margaret's living room felt more like a showroom than a home. No wonder the woman had been obsessed with controlling everyone else's exterior. She'd turned her own life into a perfect facade. "Jennifer, I need you to know something. I never intended for this to happen. But you're not sorry it did." The statement wasn't a question, and Sarah found herself examining her own feelings with uncomfortable honesty. "I'm sorry your mother is in jail. I'm sorry she lost everything. I'm sorry you're going through this. But I'm not sorry the harassment stopped, and I'm not sorry people will get their money back." Jennifer laughed bitterly. "What money? The HOA account is empty. Mom spent it all on that stupid deck. Even if people sue and win, there's nothing to collect." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean? The embezzlement charges? $30,000 stolen from the HOA account to build Dad's memorial deck. She took money that was supposed to maintain community areas, pay for landscaping, handle emergency repairs. It's all gone." The full scope of Margaret's betrayal was becoming clear. So if homeowners get their fines reversed, the HOA can't pay them back. The association will have to dissolve, and everyone who was illegally fined will have lost their money permanently. Jennifer's voice was hollow. "My mother didn't just steal from the community fund. She stole from every person she fined, because now there's no way to make them whole." Sarah stared out the window at the half-demolished deck, finally understanding the true cost of Margaret's grief-driven madness. The woman hadn't just hurt people with excessive fines, she'd stolen their money to fund her memorial to the dead. "There might be a way," Sarah said slowly. Jennifer looked up sharply. "What kind of way?" "If your mother cooperates fully with— the investigation provides complete documentation of every fine she issued and agrees to certain conditions, the prosecutor might be willing to negotiate." "What conditions?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing what she was about to propose would change everything. "Full restitution to every homeowner who was illegally fined, complete transparency about HOA finances, and resignation from any community leadership position." "Restitution with what money? I told you she spent it all." "Not she, me." Jennifer stared at her. "What?" "I'll provide the restitution funds. All of them. In exchange for your mother's cooperation and a guilty plea to reduce charges." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of an offer that made no financial sense and every moral sense. "Why would you do that?" Jennifer whispered. Sarah thought about the question, examining her own motivations with brutal honesty. "Because I started this chain of events. Because your mother is mentally ill with grief, not a criminal mastermind. And because 47 families shouldn't lose their money because I wanted to teach one woman a lesson." "You're talking about $50,000. I'm talking about doing what's right." Jennifer began to cry again, but these tears were different, softer, more human. "You don't understand. Mom won't accept charity, especially from you. Her pride—" "Then we don't tell her it's charity. We tell her it's a community fund, established to help the HOA transition to new leadership. We tell her the city recommended it as part of resolving the building code violations. You'd lie to her? I'd spare her dignity while doing the right thing. There's a difference. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face as if looking for deception. What do you get out of this? Yeah, peace of mind. The knowledge that I fought back against a bully without becoming one myself. And my mother? Gets a chance to start over. Somewhere else, probably, but with her freedom and some shred of dignity intact. That afternoon, Sarah met with David, Kim, and the remaining HOA board members in the community center conference room. The mood was somber, the weight of impending lawsuits and financial ruin hanging over everyone like storm clouds. The association is finished, David said without preamble. Between the embezzlement, the fraudulent fines, and the legal liability, we have no choice but to dissolve. Tom Bradley shifted in his seat. What about the people who paid illegal fines? Some folks paid thousands of dollars over the years. They'll have to pursue individual civil suits against Margaret personally, board member Patricia Wong said grimly. But given her financial situation, they won't see a penny, David finished. Sarah cleared her throat. Actually, there might be another option. She laid out her proposal, a community transition fund that would reimburse all verified illegal fines, funded by an anonymous donor and administered by a neutral third party. The board members listened with growing amazement as she outlined the terms: full documentation of Margaret's enforcement actions, independent verification of each fine's legitimacy, and direct reimbursement to affected homeowners. You're talking about establishing a $50,000 fund, Patricia said slowly. Who's going to pay for that? The anonymous donor has asked to remain private, Sarah replied, but the funds are available immediately. David leaned forward. Sarah, this is incredibly generous, but we can't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm offering. The room fell silent as the board members absorbed the magnitude of what she was proposing. There's one condition, Sarah continued. Margaret cooperates fully with the investigation and agrees to a plea deal that includes community service instead of prison time, and she resigns from any HOA position permanently. Tom was the first to speak. You're giving her a way out. I'm giving everyone a way out. Margaret gets to maintain some dignity, the community gets their money back, and we can all move forward. What if she refuses? Patricia asked. Sarah had been dreading that question. Then I'll still fund the reimbursements, but she'll face the full consequences of her actions. I won't let innocent people suffer because of one woman's pride. As the meeting broke up, David approached Sarah privately. I have to ask, why are you doing this? After everything she put you through. Sarah thought about Emma's pool toys, still floating peacefully in her backyard, and about Margaret's broken sobs on the phone. Because the point was never to destroy her, David. The point was to stop the abuse of power. Sometimes the best way to win is to help your enemy surrender with dignity. That evening, Sarah sat on her back patio as the sun set over Willowbrook Estates. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from reporters who'd gotten wind of the HOA scandal, but she'd ignored them all. This wasn't about publicity or vindication. It was about finding a way to live with the consequences of her actions. Jennifer's car pulled into Margaret's driveway, and Sarah watched as the younger woman carried in bags of groceries and what looked like legal documents. Through the window, she could see mother and daughter sitting at Margaret's perfect dining room table, having what appeared to be an intense conversation. Sarah's phone rang. Jennifer's number. She wants to see you, Jennifer said without preamble. Tomorrow morning. She says she has something to tell you. Does she know about the fund? She knows someone's offering to help. She doesn't know. It's you. Jennifer paused. Sarah, she's different. Broken, maybe. The arrest, losing the house, facing the possibility of prison. It's changed her. I'll be there. As Sarah hung up, she realized that tomorrow would determine whether her gamble on mercy would pay off or whether Margaret Chen would choose pride over redemption. Either way, Sarah had made her choice. She'd rather be the woman who offered grace than the one who demanded vengeance. The pool toys glowed softly in the underwater lights, no longer symbols of defiance but reminders that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness or cruelty could change everything. Sunday morning found Sarah standing once again on Margaret Chen's porch, but this time without a casserole dish and with a very different purpose. The newspapers had been cleared away, and through the window she could see that someone had been packing, boxes stacked in the living room, family photos wrapped in tissue paper. Jennifer answered the door with red eyes but a steadier demeanor. "She's in the back garden," she said quietly. "Fair warning, she looks terrible. The arrest, the charges, losing everything. It's aged her 10 years overnight." Sarah followed, Jennifer through the house, noting how different it felt with boxes everywhere. The museum-like perfection was gone, replaced by the chaos of a life being dismantled. In the kitchen, she could see legal documents spread across the counter, plea agreements, restitution paperwork, property transfer forms. Margaret sat on what remained of her deck, still in her bathrobe despite it being nearly noon. The woman who had once commanded neighborhood meetings with military precision looked fragile and small, her silver hair uncombed, her usual rigid posture collapsed into the defeated slump of someone who had lost everything. The deck itself was a heartbreaking sight, half demolished by the city, half torn down by Margaret's desperate midnight crew. Broken boards and scattered nails marked the place where Richard Chen's final dream had briefly lived before crumbling under the weight of bureaucracy and grief. "Mrs. Mitchell," Margaret said without turning around. Her voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. "Jennifer tells me you have a proposal." Sarah sat down carefully on one of the intact deck boards, maintaining some distance but close enough to have a real conversation. "I do. But first, I want to apologize." Margaret's laugh was bitter and broken. "You want to apologize? To me? I never intended for things to go this far. I filed a complaint about building violations because I was angry about harassment and double standards. I didn't know about your husband, about your grief, about the embezzlement. If you had known what, you would have let me continue stealing from my neighbors? You would have overlooked the illegal construction?" Margaret finally turned to look at her, and Sarah was shocked by the change. The imperious HOA president was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed woman who looked like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "Maybe I would have tried to find another way to stop the harassment. Maybe I would have talked to you directly instead of going to the city. I wouldn't have listened." Margaret's admission was quiet but firm. "I was so angry, Sarah. At Richard for dying, at God for taking him, at the world for continuing when mine had stopped. Taking control of this neighborhood, enforcing rules, making everything perfect. It was the only thing that made me feel like I had any power left." They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the wreckage of Margaret's memorial to her husband and her own downfall. "Jennifer told me about your offer," Margaret continued. $50,000 to reimburse the people I stole from. It's not my money, officially. It's a community transition fund from an anonymous donor. Margaret's eyes sharpened slightly, a ghost of her former acuity flickering to life. Anonymous donor, how convenient. She studied Sarah's face. "Why would you do this? After everything I put you through?" Sarah had rehearsed this conversation in her mind, but sitting here with this broken woman, the prepared words felt inadequate. "Because 47 families shouldn't lose their money because of a war between you and me. Because your husband's memory deserves better than being associated with theft and corruption, and because..." She paused, struggling with the words. "Because I recognize grief when I see it, even when it's disguised as cruelty."
Grief doesn't excuse what I did. No, it doesn't. But it explains it. An explanation isn't the same as justification, but it might be a starting point for redemption. Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring at the half-demolished deck.
That had cost her everything. "The prosecutor wants me to plead guilty to embezzlement and fraud. 5 years minimum, maybe 10. Or you could accept the plea deal. cooperation, full restitution, community service, and a suspended sentence with probation. Funded by your anonymous donor. Funded by someone who believes in second chances. Margaret stood up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She walked to the edge of the deck where it overlooked her meticulously maintained garden, a garden that would soon belong to someone else. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she asked. "It's not losing the house or facing prison or even the humiliation. It's knowing that I became everything Richard would have hated. He was the kindest man I ever knew, Sarah. He helped neighbors. He volunteered at the food bank. He never said an unkind word about anyone. And in trying to build something beautiful for him, I turned into a monster." The pain in her voice was so raw that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Margaret, grief changes people. It doesn't have to define who you become moving forward. How can you say that to me, after what I did to you, to this whole neighborhood?" Sarah thought about pool toys and measuring tapes, about sleepless nights, worrying about fines and the fear that had dominated her life for months. Then she thought about Eleanor Patterson's forged complaints, about families who'd paid thousands in illegitimate fines, about the systematic abuse of power that had masqueraded as community protection. "Because the alternative is letting your worst moment be your final moment," Sarah said. "And I don't think that's what Richard would want for you." Margaret began to cry then, not the angry tears of frustration Sarah had seen before, but the deep, grieving sobs of someone finally allowing themselves to feel the full weight of their losses. Sarah found herself moving closer, not quite touching, but close enough to offer presence in the face of overwhelming pain. "I miss him so much," Margaret whispered. "Everything I did, every rule I enforced, every fine I issued. I thought if I could just make everything perfect, if I could control enough variables, maybe the pain would stop. Maybe I could build a world where people like Richard don't just die and leave their wives alone. But that's not how the world works. No. And in trying to control it, I hurt people who never deserved it. I hurt you. I hurt children who just wanted to play with pool toys. I hurt elderly neighbors who trusted me. I hurt everyone." They sat together in the ruins of Margaret's perfect world, two women who had been enemies but were now something more complex. Perpetrator and victim grappling with the messy reality of human fallibility and the possibility of grace. The plea. "Deal," Sarah said eventually. "Will you take it?" Margaret wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her bathrobe, and for a moment, Sarah saw a glimpse of the dignified woman who had once commanded respect before grief had twisted her into something unrecognizable. "On one condition," Margaret said. "I want to apologize to every person I find, personally, face to face, not as part of some legal settlement, but because they deserve to hear that I know what I did was wrong." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the anger and resentment she'd carried for months. "I think that can be arranged. And I want you to know something," Margaret continued. "When I move away from here, and I will move away because I can never live in a place where I cause so much harm, I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends, not just to the people here, but to anyone I can help. Richard always said the best apology is changed behavior. I think he was right." Margaret stood up and extended her hand to Sarah. "I'm sorry. For the harassment, for the fines, for making your daughter's visits less joyful, for being the kind of neighbor who measures property lines instead of offering help. I'm sorry for all of it." Sarah took her hand, feeling the weight of months of conflict settling into something that might eventually become peace. "I accept your apology, Margaret, and I'm sorry for your loss. Truly." As they shook hands in the ruins of the deck that had started it all, Sarah realized that victory looked nothing like she'd expected. There were no clear winners or losers, no satisfying moments of triumph or defeat. There was only the messy, complicated work of human beings trying to find their way back to decency after grief and anger had led them astray. 6 months later, Sarah was grilling burgers on her patio when Emma ran up from the pool dripping wet and grinning. "Mom, did you see? Someone new moved into Mrs. Chen's old house." Sarah looked over at the house where Margaret had once lived. A young family was moving boxes in while their twin toddlers played on the lawn, actually played, with toys scattered on the grass and laughter filling the air. "They have kids my age," Emma continued, "and they asked if I wanted to come over for a pool party next weekend." Sarah smiled, watching as one of the new neighbors waved at her from across the yard. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had been dissolved, replaced by a simple neighborhood association focused on community events rather than enforcement. Property values had actually increased once people felt free to live in their homes instead of treating them like museum displays. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thought you'd like to know, finished my 200 hours of community service at the food bank. Starting volunteer work at a grief counseling center next week. Thank you for giving me a chance to be better. MC." Sarah smiled and looked out at